Hi guys, welcome to this new session. We are going to study Indian economy chapter 2 NCRT in this session. In the first lecture we learned that how in the state of Indian economy on the eve of independence. In this chapter we learn about how the planning went from 1950 to 1990 in the economy system. Introduction. On 15 August 1947, India woke to a new dawn of freedom. Finally, we were masters of our own destiny after some 200 years of British rule. The job of nation building was now in our hands. The leaders of independent India had to decide, among other things, the type of economic system. So, we were deciding the type of economic system we would have for the country. There are different types of economic system like capitalist, socialist, and mixed economy. So the leaders of the nation were discussing on type of economic system they want to have. So the most suitable for our nation a system which could promote a welfare of all. We wanted a system which could promote welfare of all rather than a few. There were different types of economic systems, and among them socialism appealed to Jawaharlal Nehru the most. The Jawaharlal Nehru was a very the socialism appealed to Jawaharlal Nehru the most. He was excited. He was influenced by the socialist view. But he was not. However, he was not in favor of the kind of socialism established in the former Soviet Union, where all the means of production, all the factories and farms of country were owned by government. He was not of this view that every farmhouse, every property will be government property. So he wanted to some change in that. There was no private property in the socialism, in their socialism. So it was not possible in a democracy like India for the government to change the ownership pattern, land and other properties of its citizens in the way that it was done in the former Soviet Union. The Nehru and many other leaders, thinkers of the newly independent India sought an alternative to the extreme versions of capitalism and socialism, because sympathizing with the socialist outlook they found that answer in an economic system which in the view combined the best features of socialism without its drawbacks. In this view, India would be a socialist society with a strong public sector but also with private property and democracy. So we come out with some private property and democracy. Public sector but also with private property and democracy the government would plan. So let us learn about the types of economic system. Every society has to answer three questions. What goods and services should be produced in the country? How should goods and services be produced? Should producer use more human labor or more capital machines for producing things? How should the goods and services be distributed among people? And according to the answer of this question, we arrive at three types of socialist: capitalist, socialist, and mixed economy. So first learn about capital society. One answer to this question is to depend on the market forces. When we depend on market forces of supply and demand in a market economy, it is called capitalism. Only those consumers will be produced that are in demand, goods that can be sold profitably either in domestic or in foreign markets. If cars are in demand, cars will be produced, and if bicycles are in demand, bicycle will be produced. If labor is cheaper than capital, more labor intensive method of production will be used, and vice versa. In a capitalist society, the goods produced are distributed among people not on the basis of what people need but on the basis of purchasing power. It is on the basis of purchasing power, the ability to buy goods and services. That is, one has to have the money in the pocket to buy it. Low cost housing for the poor is much needed but will not count as demand in the market sense, because the poor do not have the purchasing power to back the demand. As a result, this commodity will not be produced and suppliers as per market forces. Such a society did not appeal to Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, for it meant the great majority of people of the country would be left behind without a chance to improve their quality of life. And what is a socialist society? Let us learn. In a socialist society, totally different manner. In a socialist society, the government decides what goods are to be produced in accordance with the needs of society. It is assumed that the government knows what is good for the people of the country, and so the desires of individual consumers are not given much importance. The government decides how goods are to be produced and how they should be distributed. In principle, distribution under socialism is supposed to be backed on what people need and not on what they can afford to purchase. Unlike under capitalism, for example, a socialist nation provides free health care to all its citizens. Strictly, a socialist society has no private property since everything is owned by the state. In Cuba and China, for example, most of the economic activities are governed by the socialistic principles. And what do we finally adopt is the mixed economy. So most economies are mixed economy, that is, government and the market together answer the three questions of what to produce, how to produce, and how to distribute what is produced. In a mixed economy, the market will provide whatever goods and services it can produce well, and the government will provide essential goods and services which the market fails to do. So we understand the three types of market: capitalist, socialist, and mixed economy. In the capitalist society, the main thing is market forces operate, and the goods only those goods are produced which are in demand, and the purchasing power of people is on the ability to buy goods and services. And in this, it is not suitable for India because in this the equitable growth is not appealed. But a socialist society answers the three questions in a totally different manner. Socialist society is the government decides what goods are to be produced in accordance with the needs of society. It is assumed that the government knows what is good and bad for the people of the country. But it is not. But in our country, it is not only socialism. It is mixed economies of socialism. In mixed economies, the both government and market forces determine what is good for the people. Now, the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 and Directive Principle of Indian Constitution reflected this outlook of our new economy. In 1950, the Planning Commission was set up with the Prime Minister as its chairperson. The era of 5-year plans began. So the era of five-year plan began. The goals of 5-year plans. Now, what were the goals of 5-year plans? The goals of 5-year plans were growth, equitable, modernization, self-reliance, and equity. These four were the goals of the Planning Commission, which set up 5-year plans. So, due to limited resources, a choice has to be made in each plan about which of the goals to be given primary importance. Nevertheless, the planners have to ensure that as far as possible, the policies of the plans do not contradict these four goals. Let us now learn about this planning in some detail. So, nevertheless, the planners have to ensure that as far as possible, the policies of the plans do not contradict these four goals. The growth. It refers to increase in the country's capacity to produce the output of goods and services within the country. So the output in our country, any output of the country is called growth. It implies either a large stock of producing capital or a larger size of supporting services like transport and banking. So we have to decide. It implies a large size of supporting services. So productive capital is related to manufacturing, and supporting services are are like transport and banking. And we know that there are three main sectors of the economy: agriculture sector, industrial sector, and services sector. So the supporting services sector like transport and banking is the services sector, and productive capital is the manufacturing sector. A good indicator of economic growth in the language of economics is a steady increase in the GDP. The growth is also measured by gross domestic product. Then what is GDP? The GDP is market value of all the goods and services produced in the country during a year, particularly during a fiscal year. So if the cake is suppose that there is a cake and growth is increase in, suppose that there is a cake and cake GDP as a cake, and growth is increase in the size of the cake. If the cake is larger, more people can enjoy it. So it is like the having a cake, GDP is called the cake, and growth is its size. So if growth is more, the size of cake is more, and more people can enjoy the cake. So it is like that. The GDP of country is derived from the different sectors of the economy, namely the agriculture sector, industrial sector, and the services sector. The contribution made by each of these sectors make up the structural composition of the economy. So what are the structural composition of the economy? The structural composition of economy is services sector, industrial sector, and agricultural sector. What is modernization means now? Modernization: to increase the production of goods and services, the producer have to adopt a new technology. The modernization is means adoption of new technology. Suppose a farmer can increase the output on the farm by using new seed varieties instead of using old ones. Similarly, a factory can increase the output by using a new type of machine. Adoption of new technology is called modernization. So what we get here is adoption of new technology is modernization. However, modernization does not refer only to the use of new technology, but also to change in social outlook, such as recognition that women have same right as men. It is also modernization that women has same right as men, and we use women as our resource in banks, factories, and schools, and such society is most occasions is also prosperous. So we get prosperity from both, including the women in our working sector. A nation can promote economic growth and modernization by using its resources or by using resources imported from other nations. So we can produce by through our resources or resources bought from resources imported from other nations. The first 7 year plans gave importance to self-reliance, which means avoiding imports of those goods. So self-reliance means self-productive, and there is no need of other nations to import and export. So the first 7 5 year plans gave importance to self-reliance, which means avoiding imports of those goods which could be produced in India itself. This policy was considered a necessity in order to reduce our dependence on foreign countries, especially for food. So this policy was considered very necessary because we were dependent on foreign foods, food imported from foreign. It is understood that people who were recently freed from foreign domination should give importance to self. Further, it was feared that dependence on imported food supplies, foreign technology, and foreign capital make India's sovereignty vulnerable to foreign interference in our policies. So if we are just freed from foreign rule at that time, and we were afraid of the foreign trade, so we adopted self-reliance as our goal of 7 5 year plans. And now we go to equity. What is equity? As you know, equity is equitable growth. Equity is very important in economy, because equity, if we don't follow equitable growth, if you don't follow the economical growth equity, there is increase, there may be growth, but if it is not equitable, it is of no use, because it may be there that only 5 people are contributing to GDP and other people are not contributing, and there is no welfare to them. So now growth, modernization and self-reliance by themselves may not improve the kind of life which people are living. A country can have high growth. As I said, a country can have high growth, the most modern technology developed in the country itself, and also have most of its people living in poverty. It is important to, so a country can have high growth, but most of the people can be having poverty. It is important to ensure the benefits of economic prosperity reach the poorer section of wealth, instead enjoyed only by the rich. So in addition to growth, modernization, self-reliance, equity is also important. Every Indian should be able to meet his basic needs such as food, decent house, education and healthcare, and inequality in the distribution of wealth should be reduced. Inequality in distribution of wealth should be reduced. Let us now see how the first 7-year plans covering the period 1950 to 1990 attempted to attain these 4 goals, and extent to which they succeeded in doing so, with reference to agriculture, industry and trade. Agriculture. As we know, there are 3 sectors of economy. The agriculture, India is an agricultural country, agriculture based country. So we first learn about the situation in agriculture. So the policymakers of independent India had to address the issue, which through reforms and promoting the use of high yielding variety. HYV seeds were used, and certain incentives to fertilizers the use of fertilizers were promoted through green revolution. What are land reforms? At the time of independence, the land tenure system was characterized by intermediaries such as zamindars, jagirdars. So who merely collected rent from the actual tillers of the soil without contributing towards improvement on the farm. The low productivity of agriculture sector forced India to import food from United States of America. Equity and in agriculture called for land reforms, which primarily referred to change in the ownership of land holdings. We have to change the land holdings, and the primary aim of land reforms was to have land for all. Even the tiller has right to have the land. Just a year after independence, steps were taken to abolish these intermediaries such as zamindars and jagirdars, and to make the tillers the owners of the land. The idea behind the move was ownership of land would give incentives to tillers to invest in making improvements, provided sufficient capital was made available to them. Land ceiling. Land ceiling was another policy to promote equality in the agriculture sector. This means fixing the maximum size. In India, between 1950 and 1990, the proportion of GDP contributed by agriculture declined significantly, but not the population depending on it. 67.5% in 1990 to 64.9% by 1990. Why was such large proportion of the population engaged in agriculture? Although agriculture output could have grown, much less people working in the sector. The answer is that the industrial sector and services sector did not absorb people working in the agriculture sector. So what is the answer? Did not absorb the people working in the agriculture sector. Industry and trade. Economists have found that poor nations can progress only if they have a good industrial sector. Industry provides employment which is more stable than employment in agriculture. It promotes modernization and overall prosperity. It is for this reason that the 5-year plans place a lot of emphasis on industrial development. Largely confined to cotton, textiles and jute, there were 2 well-managed iron firms, steel firms, one Jamshedpur and one in. The big question facing the policy makers was what should be the role of government and private sector in industrial development. At the time of independence, Indian industry did not have capital to undertake investment in industrial ventures required for the development of our economy, nor was market big enough to encourage industrial to undertake major projects even if they have capital to do so. Industrial policy resolution thus was invested in accordance with the goal of state controlling the commanding heights of economy. The industry policy in 1956 was adopted. This industry formed the basis of second five-year plan, the plan which was the basis of socialist pattern of society. This resolution classified industry into three categories. The first category comprised industry which would be exclusively owned by the state. The second category consisted industry in which the private sector could supplement the effort of the state sector, and a mixed sector with the private and the public sector. And the third category consists the remaining industries which to be done by the private sector. So we have three categories of industries. The first category is the industry in which the state is whole responsible. The second in which state and private both, and third is private. Although there was a category of industries left to the private sector, the sector was kept under state control through a system of licenses. No new industries was allowed unless a license was obtained from the government. So it was a license was required to obtain the industrial establishment. This policy was used for promoting industry in backward regions. It was easier to obtain a license if the industry unit, even an existing industry had to obtain license for expanding output for diversifying product. So even an existing industry had to obtain a license for expanding the output or diversifying the product. This was meant to ensure that the quantity of goods produced was not more than the economy required. License to expand production was given only if the government was convinced that the economy required a large quantity of goods. Small scale industries. In 1955, small scale industries were set up. At present, its maximum investment rupees 1 crore. It is believed that small scale industries are more labor intensive, that is, they use more labor than the large scale industries and therefore generate more employment. But these industries cannot compete with the big industrial firms. It is obvious that the development of a small scale industry requires them to be shielded from the larger firms. For this purpose, the production for a number of products was reserved for the. So there were some products reserved for the small scale industry only. The criteria of reservation being the utility of these units to manufacture goods. They were also given concessions such as lower excise duty and bank loans at lower interest rates. So the trade policy, now we learn about trade policy, in which was import substitution. What is trade policy? The industrial policy that we adopted was closely related to trade policy. In the first 7 5-year plan, trade was characterized by what is called an inward-looking strategy. It was an inward-looking strategy, and we followed technically a term called import substitution. Import substitution. Import substitution. This policy is aimed at replacing or substituting imports with domestic production. For example, instead of importing vehicles made from foreign country, industries would be encouraged to produce them in India itself. In this policy, the government protects the domestic industries from foreign competition. Protection from imports take two forms: tariffs and quotas. Tariffs. The policy of protection is based on the notion that industries of developing countries are not in a position to compete against in the goods produced by more developed countries. It is assumed that if the domestic industries are protected, they will learn to compete in the course of time. Our planners also feared this possibility of foreign exchange being spent on import of luxury goods if no restriction are placed on imports, nor was any serious thought given to promote until the mid-1980s. Effect of policies on industrial development. The achievement of India's industrial sector during the first 7 plans are impressive. The proportion of GDP contributed by the industrial sector increased from 11.8% in the 1950s to 24.6% in 1991. The rise in the industrial sector of GDP is an important indicator of the development. The 6% annual growth rate of the industrial sector during the period is commendable. No longer was Indian industry restricted largely to cotton, style and jute. In fact, the industrial sector became well diverse. We were diverse not only the cotton textile but also diverse by 1990. The promotion of small scale industries gave opportunity to those people who did not have capital to start large firms to get into business. Protection from foreign competition enabled the development of indigenous industry in the areas of electronics and automobiles otherwise could not have developed. So the promotion of small scale industries gave opportunity to those people who did not have capital to start large firms to get into business. Protection from foreign competition enabled the development of indigenous industries. So the protection enabled us the indigenous industries and in the areas of electronics and automobile sectors which otherwise could not have developed. In spite of the contribution made by the public sector to the growth of Indian economy, some economists are critical of the performance of many public enterprises. It was proposed at the beginning of this chapter that initially the public sector was required in a big way. It is now widely held that the state enterprises continued to produce certain goods and services, often monopolizing them. Although this was no longer required, an example of the provision of telecommunication service, this industry continued to reserve for the public sector even after it was realized that public sector firms could also provide them. So due to absence of the competition even till 1990s, one had to wait for a long time to get a telephone connection. Another instant could be a telephone connection. Get it? One had to wait for a long time to get a telephone connection, and another start would be a modern bread, which was being publicly produced, but later it was thought that it could be privately done. So the point is that after 4 decades of plant economy, no distinction was made between what the public sector alone can do, what private sector can also do. For example, if so now there were 3 questions that what did the public sector alone can do and what the private sector can alone do. For example, even now only the public sector supplies national defense, and even though the private sector can manage hotels well, yet the government also runs hotel. This has led to some scholars to argue that the state should get out of the areas which the private sector can manage, and the government may concentrate its resources on important services which the private sector cannot provide. Many public firm sector were incurred huge losses but continued to function because it is difficult to close a government undertaking even if it is drained on nation's limited resources. This does not mean that private firms are always profitable. Indeed, quite a few of the public firms were originally private firms which were on the verge of closure due to losses. They were then nationalized to protect the jobs of the workers. However, a loss-making private firm will not waste resources by kept running despite of the losses. The need to obtain a license to start an industry was misused by industrial houses. A big industrialist would get a license not for starting a new firm but to prevent competitors from starting new firms. This excessive regulation of what come to be called permit license has prevented certain firms from becoming more efficient. More time spent by industrialists in trying to obtain a license or lobby with the concerned ministries rather than on thinking on about how to improve their products. So this whole para is important. I read it. The more time was spent by industry in trying to obtain a license or lobby with the concerned ministries rather than thinking on about what products they could form. The protection of foreign competitors is also being criticized on the ground that it discontinued even after it does prove to be more harm than good. Due to restriction on imports, the Indian consumers had to purchase whatever the Indian production produced. So due to competition, there were no other products available, and the consumer had to take what the producers produced. The producers were aware that they had a captive market, so they had no incentive to improve the quality of their goods. Why should they think of improving quality when they could sell low quality items at high prices? Competition from import forces our producers to be more difficult. A few economists also point out that the public sector is not meant for earning profits but to promote the welfare of the nation. A few economists also point out that the public sector is not meant for earning profits but to promote the welfare of the nation. The public sector firms on this view should be evaluated on the basis of the extent to which they contribute to the welfare. Conclusion. The progress of Indian economy during the first 7 plans was impressive. Indeed, our industry became far more diverse compared to the situation at independence. India became self-sufficient in food production thanks to green revolution. Land reforms resulted in abolition of the hated zamindari system. However, many economists became dissatisfied with the performance of many public sector enterprises. Excessive government regulation prevented the growth of entrepreneurship. In the name of self-reliance, our producers were protected against foreign competition, and they did not give them the incentive to improve the quality of goods that they produced. Our policy were inward oriented, and so we failed to develop a strong export sector. The need for reform of economic policy was widely felt in the context of changing global economic scenario, and a new economic policy was initiated in 1991 to make our economy more excellent. This is the subject of next chapter.